Alexander Hamilton Stevens was an American politician from Georgia and Vice President of the Confederate States of America during the American Civil War. He also served as a U.S. representative from Georgia and as the 50th governor of Georgia from 1882 until his death in 1883. He was an old Whig Party friend and ally of Abraham Lincoln. They met in the closing days of the Civil War, but could not come to terms. Early life and career. Alexander H. Stevens was born on February 11, 1812. His parents were Andrew Baskins Stevens and Margaret Grier. The Stevenses lived on a farm near present-day Crawfordville, Taliaferro County, Georgia. At the time of Alexander Stevens's birth, the farm was part of Wilkes County. Taliaferro County was created in 1825 from land in Greene, Hancock, Oglethorpe, Warren, and Wilkes counties. His father, a native of Pennsylvania, came to Georgia at 12 years of age, in 1795. According to the biographical sketch of Linton Stevens, Andrew B. Stevens was endowed with uncommon intellectual faculties. He had sound practical judgment. He was a safe counselor, sagacious, self-reliant, candid and courageous. His mother, a Georgia native and sister of Grier's almanac founder Robert Grier, died in 1812 at the age of 26. Alexander Stevens was only 3 months old. In the introduction to Recollections of Alexander H. Stevens, there is this about his mother and her family. Margaret came of folk who had a liking for books, and a turn for law, war, and meteorology. The introduction continues. In her son's character was a marked blending of parental traits. He, Alexander Stevens, was thrifty, generous, progressive, one of the best lawyers in the land, a reader and collector of books, a close observer of the weather, and father of the Weather Bureau of the United States. In 1814, Andrew B. Stevens married Matilda Lindsay, daughter of Revolutionary War Colonel John Lindsay. In 1826, when Alexander Stevens was 14 years old, his father, Andrew, and stepmother, Matilda, died only days apart in May of that year. Their deaths caused him and several siblings to be scattered among relatives. He grew up poor and in difficult circumstances. Not long after the deaths of his father and his stepmother, Alexander Stevens was sent to live with his mother's other brother, General Aaron W. Grier, near Raytown, Georgia. General Grier had inherited his own father's library, said to be the largest library in all that part of the country. Alexander Stevens, who read voraciously even as a youth, mentions the library in his Recollections. Frail but precocious, the young Stevens acquired his continued education through the generosity of several benefactors. One of them was the Presbyterian minister Alexander Hamilton Webster, who presided over a school in Washington, Georgia. Out of respect for his mentor, Stevens adopted Webster's middle name, Hamilton, as his own. Stevens attended the Franklin College in Athens, where he was roommates with Crawford W. Long and a member of the Phi Kappa Literary Society. He graduated at the top of his class in 1832. After several unhappy years teaching school, he took up legal studies, passed the bar in 1834, and began a successful career as a lawyer in Crawfordville. During his 32 years of practice, he gained a reputation as a capable defender of the wrongfully accused. None of his clients charged with capital crimes were executed. One notable case was that of a slave woman accused of attempted murder. Stevens volunteered to defend her. Despite the circumstantial evidence presented against her, Stevens won an acquittal for the woman. Stevens was extremely sickly throughout his life. Though his adult height was 5 feet 7 inches, he often weighed less than 100 pounds. As his wealth increased, Stevens began acquiring land and slaves. By the time of the Civil War, Stevens owned 34 slaves and several thousand acres. He entered politics in 1836, and was elected to the Georgia House of Representatives, serving there until 1841. In 1842, he was elected to the Georgia State Senate. Congressional Career. Stevens served in the U.S. House from October 2, 1843, to March 3, 1859, from the 28th Congress through the 35th Congress. In 1843, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives as a Whig, in a special election to fill the vacancy caused by the resignation of Mark A. Cooper. This seat was at large, as Georgia did not have House districts until the next year. Stevens was re-elected from the 7th District as a Whig in 1844, 1846, and 1848, as a Unionist in 1851, and again as a Whig in 1853. In 1855 and 1857, his re-elections came as a Democrat. As a national lawmaker during the crucial decades before the Civil War, Stevens was involved in all of the major sectional battles. He began as a moderate defender of slavery but later accepted the prevailing Southern rationale utilized to defend the institution. Stevens quickly rose to prominence as one of the leading Southern Whigs in the House. He supported the annexation of Texas in 1845. Along with his fellow Whigs, he vehemently opposed the Mexican-American War, and later became an equally vigorous opponent of the Wilmot Proviso, which would have barred the extension of slavery into territories that were acquired after the war. He also controversially tabled the Clayton Compromise, which would have excluded slavery from the Oregon Territory and left the issue of slavery in New Mexico and California to the Supreme Court. This would later nearly kill Stevens when he argued with Judge Francis H. Cone, who stabbed him repeatedly in a fit of anger. Stevens was physically outmatched by his larger assailant, but he remained defiant during the attack, refusing to recant his positions even at the cost of his life. Only the intervention of others saved him. Stevens' wounds were serious, and he returned home to Crawfordville to recover. He and Cone reconciled before Cone's death in 1859. Stevens and fellow Georgia Representative Robert Toombs campaigned for the election of Zachary Taylor as president in 1848. Both were chagrined and angered when Taylor proved less than pliable on aspects of the Compromise of 1850. Stevens and Toombs both supported the Compromise of 1850, though they opposed the exclusion of slavery from the territories on the theory that such lands belonged to all of the people. The pair returned from the District of Columbia to Georgia to secure support for the measures at home. Both men were instrumental in the drafting and approval of the Georgia Platform, which rallied Unionists throughout the Deep South. Stevens and Toombs were not only political allies but also lifelong friends. Stevens was described as a highly sensitive young man of serious and joyless habits of consuming ambition, of poverty-fed pride, and of morbid preoccupation with himself, a contrast to the robust, wealthy, and convivial Toombs. But this strange camaraderie endured with singular accord throughout their lives. By this time, Stevens had departed the ranks of the Whig Party, its northern wing generally not amenable to some Southern interests. Back in Georgia, Stevens, Toombs, and Democratic Representative Howell Cobb formed the Constitutional Union Party. The party overwhelmingly carried the state in the ensuing election and, for the first time, Stevens returned to Congress no longer a Whig. Stevens spent the next few years as a constitutional unionist, essentially an independent. He vigorously opposed the dismantling of the Constitutional Union Party when it began crumbling in 1851. Political realities soon forced the Union Democrats in the party to affiliate once more with the National Party, and by mid-1852, the combination of both Democrats and Whigs, which had formed a party behind the Compromise, had ended. The sectional issue surged to the forefront again in 1854, when Senator Stephen A. This legislation aroused fury in the North because it applied the popular sovereignty principle to the territory, in violation of the Missouri Compromise. Had it not been for Stevens, the bill would have probably never passed in the House. He employed an obscure House rule to bring the bill to a vote. He later called this the greatest glory of my life. From this point on, Stevens voted with the Democrats. Until after 1855, Stevens could not be properly called a Democrat, and even then, he never officially declared it. In this move, Stevens broke irrevocably with many of his former Whig colleagues. When the Whig Party disintegrated after the election of 1852, some Whigs flocked to the short-lived Know Nothing Party. But Stevens fiercely opposed the Know Nothings both for their secrecy and their anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic position. Despite his late arrival in the Democratic Party, Stevens quickly rose through the ranks. He even served as President James Buchanan's floor manager in the House during the fruitless battle for the Lecompton Constitution for Kansas Territory in 1857. He was instrumental in framing the failed English bill after it became clear that Lecompton would not pass. Stevens did not seek re-election to Congress in 1858. As sectional peace eroded during the next 2 years, Stevens became increasingly critical of Southern extremists. Although virtually the entire South had spurned Douglas as a traitor to Southern rights because he had opposed the Lecompton Constitution and broke on with Buchanan, Stevens remained on good terms with Douglas and even served as one of his presidential electors in the election of 1860. According to Bruce Catton, he was given one of the most haunting nicknames ever worn by an American politician, the Little Pale Star from Georgia, Vice President of the Confederacy. In 1861, Stevens was elected as a delegate to the Georgia Secession Convention to decide Georgia's response to the election of Abraham Lincoln. During the convention, as well as during the 1860 presidential campaign, Stevens, who came to be known as the Sage of Liberty Hall, called for the South to remain loyal to the Union, likening it to a leaking but fixable boat. During the convention, he reminded his fellow delegates that Republicans were a minority in Congress and, even with a Republican president, they would be forced to compromise just as the two sections had for decades. Because the Supreme Court had voted 7-2 in the Dred Scott case, it would take decades of Senate-approved appointments to reverse it. He voted against secession in the convention but asserted the right to secede if the federal government continued allowing northern states to nullify the fugitive slave law with personal liberty laws. He was elected to the Confederate Congress and was chosen by the Congress as vice president of the provisional government. He was then elected vice president of the Confederacy in February 1861. He took the provisional oath of office on February 11, 1861, then the full-term oath of office on February 22, 1862 and served until his arrest on May 11, 1865. Stevens officially served in office 8 days longer than President Jefferson Davis. He took his oath 7 days before Davis's inauguration and was captured the day after Davis. On March 21, 1861, Stevens gave his famous cornerstone speech in Savannah, Georgia. In it he declared that slavery was the natural condition of blacks and the foundation of the Confederacy. He declared, "Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite ideas. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition." On the eve of the outbreak of the Civil War, he counseled delay in moving militarily against the Northern-held Fort Sumter and Fort Pickens so that the Confederacy could build up its forces and stock resources. In 1862, Stevens first publicly expressed his opposition to the Davis administration. Throughout the war he denounced many of the president's policies, including conscription, suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, impressment, various financial and taxation policies, and Davis's military strategy. In mid-1863, Davis dispatched Stevens on a fruitless mission to Washington to discuss prisoner exchanges. but the Union victory of Gettysburg made the Lincoln administration refuse to receive him. As the war continued and the fortunes of the Confederacy sank lower, Stevens became more outspoken in his opposition to the administration. On March 16, 1864, Stevens delivered a speech to the Georgia legislature that was widely reported in both the North and the South. In it, he excoriated the Davis administration for its support of conscription and suspension of habeas corpus, and supported a block of resolutions aimed at securing peace. From then until the end of the war, as he continued to press for actions aimed at bringing about peace, his relations with Davis, never warm to begin with, turned completely sour. On February 3, 1865, he was one of 3 Confederate commissioners who met with Lincoln on the steamer River Queen at the Hampton Roads Conference, a fruitless effort to discuss measures to bring an end to the fight. Stevens and Lincoln had been close friends and Whig political allies in the 1840s. Postbellum Career. Stevens was arrested at his home in Crawfordville on May 11, 1865. He was imprisoned in Fort Warren, Boston Harbor, for 5 months until October 1865. In 1866, he was elected to the United States Senate by the first legislature convened under the new Georgia state constitution, but was not allowed to take his seat because of restrictions on former Confederates. In 1873, Stevens was elected U.S. Representative as a Democrat from the 8th District to fill the vacancy caused by the death of Ambrose R. Wright. Stevens was subsequently re-elected to the 8th District as an independent Democrat in 1874, 1876, and 1878, and as a Democrat again in 1880. He served in the 43rd through 47th Congresses, from December 1, 1873 until his resignation on November 4, 1882. On that date, he was elected and took office as governor of Georgia. His tenure as governor proved brief. Stevens died on March 4, 1883, 4 months after taking office. Almost all of his former slaves continued to work for him, often for little or no money. Whether this decision was voluntary or the result of few other options existing for former slaves in the Deep South is difficult to determine. These servants were with him upon his death. Although old and infirm, Stevens continued to work on his house and plantation. According to a former slave, a gate fell on Stevens while he and another black servant were repairing it, and he was crippled and lamed up from that time until he died. The veracity of this rumor is difficult to determine as the cited slave was not present for the event. He was interred in Oakland Cemetery in Atlanta, then reinterred on his estate, Liberty Hall, near Crawfordville. He wrote a constitutional view of the late war between the states and history of the United States. He is pictured on the CSA $20 banknote. Stevens County, Georgia, and Stevens County, Texas, bear his name, as does A. H. Stevens Historic Park, a state park near Crawfordville. A collection of Stevens' personal papers has been digitized and is available at the Rubenstein Library, Duke University. In popular culture, in Steven Spielberg's 2012 film Lincoln, Alexander H. Stevens is portrayed by Jackie Earle Haley. The film depicts him attending the Hampton Roads Conference. Legacy. A sculpture of Stevens appears in the National Statuary Hall collection, representing one of 2 figures from Georgian history, the other being Crawford W. Long. There have been calls to replace Stevens' sculpture in the collection with that of other Georgians, such as Martin Luther King, Jr., or Ray Charles Robinson. Bibliography. Rudolph R. von Abel, Alexander H. Stevens. A biography. Henry Cleveland, Alexander H. Stevens in Public and Private, with Letters and Speeches. William C. Davis. The Union That Shaped the Confederacy. Robert Toombs and Alexander H. Stevens. Richard Malcolm Johnston and William Hand Brown, Life of Alexander H. Stevens. Lewis Pendleton, Alexander H. Stevens. Thomas E. Schott, Alexander H. Stephens of Georgia, A Biography. W.P. Trent, Southern Statesman of the Old Regime. John L. Wakeland, Biographical Dictionary of the Confederacy. Wilson, Edmund. Patriotic Gore. Studies in the Literature of the American Civil War, ch. 11, on his book. Biographical article from Harper's Weekly, February 23, 1861.